The Young and the Restless spoilers Thurdays full update the 1st of January 2026. In Genoa City, loyalty was never a passive trait. It was a currency constantly tested, weighed, and sometimes weaponized by those who understood power best. As the year edged closer to its end, Victor Newman began to move with deliberate calculation, setting into motion a test that would reveal far more than legal allegiance. Michael Baldwin, long trusted as both shield and sword, found himself standing on uncertain ground, not because of any single mistake, but because Victor had decided that certainty itself was a weakness. The challenge Victor prepared was subtle, wrapped in expectation rather than accusation, forcing Michael to confront a familiar but dangerous truth. In the Newman orbit, loyalty was never proven. One seat had to be reaffirmed again and again, often at personal cost. The demand was not simply professional obedience, but moral alignment, a willingness to choose Victor's interests even when they clashed with conscience, history, or personal bonds that stretched beyond the Newman empire. At the same time, Nikki Newman carried news that threatened to destabilize an already fragile equilibrium. Her decision to approach Jack Abbott was not impulsive but heavy with consequence, shaped by years of shared history, rivalry, and unspoken understanding between their families. The information she possessed was not merely unfortunate. It carried implications capable of reopening old wounds and reigniting tensions both had worked hard to suppress. Nikki understood that delivering this truth would shift the dynamic between Newman and Abbott once more, not through open warfare, but through quiet distrust that could linger and spread. Jack, who had long learned to read between the lines of Newman intentions, would not receive the news as a singular event, but as a warning gunning more signal that the fragile balance of Genoa City was tilting again, threatening alliances that had survived only through restraint and mutual exhaustion. Elsewhere, Claire Newman reached a breaking point of her own. No longer content with half answers and evasions, she turned her focus toward Holden, demanding clarity where ambiguity had been allowed to fester. Claire's insistence on truth was not born of curiosity alone, but of self-preservation, shaped by the growing realization that silence often concealed manipulation. Her confrontation carried emotional risk, as pressing for answers threatened to unravel connections she was not yet ready to lose. Yet the alternativing in the dark felt increasingly intolerable. In Genoa City, ignorance was rarely accidental, and Claire sensed that whatever Holden was withholding had the potential to redefine not only their relationship, but her understanding of her own place within the Newman legacy. Amid these mounting pressures, Audra Charles navigated the city with her usual armor intact, though cracks had begun to form beneath the surface. Her visit to Sally Spectra was framed as casual, even warm, but carried layers of unspoken meaning. Sally's gesturia Christmas gift offered late but with genuine thought landed deeper than Audra expected. The handbag was not merely an accessory. It was proof that someone had paid attention, had seen her not as a pariah or a disruptor, but as a friend worth understanding. Audra accepted it with visible appreciation, yet the gratitudes stirred discomfort as well. She was acutely aware of the imbalance of having nothing tangible to offer in return. And though she dismissed the idea of guilt, the absence lingered like a quiet accusation she refused to name. Audra spoke openly of her recent encounter with Noah Newman, describing their unexpected meeting at the club as intriguing rather than alarming. The interaction reminded her that despite the town's collective judgment, she remained capable of leaving an impression, of unsettling the careful narratives others had built around her. Sally's presence, steady and non-judgmental, reinforced Audra's belief that loyalty could exist outside bloodlines and corporate alliances. Sally was, in Audra's mind, the sole connection untouched by suspicion or rivalry, a rare constant in a city addicted to shifting sides. Audra rejected the notion that she cared about being ostracized, insisting of only to herself that exclusion had never frightened her. Yet the insistence itself suggested otherwise, revealing a defensive edge sharpened by repeated rejection. The conversation inevitably turned toward Claire, whose presence had become a source of escalating tension for Audra. She recounted their clash with sharp clarity, the humiliation of being publicly splashed with water, and her decision not to retaliate? That restraint, though strategic, gnawed at her pride. Audra framed the incident not as a defeat but as a prelude, signaling her intent to confront Claire directly and decisively in the future. This was not about a single insult. It was about hierarchy, about asserting dominance in a social structure that Audra believed had prematurely dismissed her. Sally, sensing the danger in Audra's resolve, urged caution, understanding that Genoa City rewarded patience as often as aggression. The warning, though well-meant, clashed with Audra's instinct to reclaim control through confrontation rather than retreat. When the topic shifted toward Los Angeles, Audra's composure faltered, if only briefly. She shut down any attempt to revisit what had transpired there, drawing a firm boundary around a chapter she was not prepared to reopen. The refusal spoke volumes. Whatever had occurred in LA was not simply unresolved, it was volatile, carrying consequences that Audra feared could undo what little stability she had managed to secure. By refusing to discuss it, she preserved the illusion of control, even as the weight of that buried truth continued to press inward, threatening to surface at the most inopportune moment. Across Genoa City, these seemingly separate threads began to align, weaving a larger pattern of tension and anticipation. Victor's test of Michael's loyalty signaled an impending shift within the Newman inner circle, one that could expose fractures long concealed beneath professional obligation. Nikki's decision to involve Jack risked reigniting dormant conflicts between two of the city's most powerful families. Claire's demand for truth challenged the culture of secrecy that had protected and poisoned so many relationships. And Audra's quiet resentment, coupled with her unresolved past and determination to reclaim agency, positioned her as both a potential catalyst and a liability in the conflicts to come. What bound these developments together was not coincidence, but momentum. Genoa City was once again approaching a tipping point, where private choices would collide with public consequence, and loyalty would be measured not by words, but by sacrifice. Each character stood on the edge of revelation, armed with partial truths and incomplete trust, unaware of how quickly their decisions could ignite wider fallout. In a town where power thrived on silence and timing was everything, the coming confrontations promised not resolution, but escalation, ensuring that the cost of loyalty and the price of truth will soon be demanded in full. At Society, the atmosphere carried a polished calm that barely concealed the tension simmering beneath the surface, and Jack Abbott felt it the moment he sat down across from Billy. His attention drifted repeatedly to his phone, not out of impatience but expectation, the kind rooted in unfinished conversations and promises left hanging in the air. Nikki Newman's silence weighed on him more heavily than he cared to admit, each unanswered glance reinforcing the sense that timing was slipping beyond his control. Billy noticed, of course, because Billy always did, yet said nothing, understanding that some waits were strategic and others were emotional traps disguised as patience. Jack had barely settled into that uneasy stillness when the balance of the room shifted, announcing Victor Newman's arrival before he even spoke. Victor carried himself with the same imposing certainty he always had, a man who believed the future bent toward his will, and he wasted no time projecting that belief outward, presenting the coming year as one defined by upheaval and consequence. Jack met Victor's confidence without flinching, refusing to grant him the satisfaction of intimidation. If Victor expected submission or concern, he found neither. Jack's resolve had been hardened by loss, betrayal, and the slow realization that restraint had only ever allowed Victor to dominate the narrative. He challenged Victor's sense of victory, reminding him that what appeared finished was often merely paused, and that premature celebration had undone many powerful men before. Victor, however, remained unmoved, asserting that the damage done to Jabot was already irreversible, that Jack had failed not only himself, but the legacy his father had entrusted to him. The accusation cut deep, not because it was entirely true, but because Victor believed it with unwavering conviction. Jack, far from retreating, found a grim satisfaction in imagining the moment Victor's certainty would collapse, when arrogance would finally be replaced by disbelief. He welcomed that reckoning, convinced that the advantage had quietly shifted, even if Victor was not yet capable of seeing it. Jack and Billy left together, their departure calculated rather than reactive, leaving Victor alone with his assumptions. The moment they were gone, Victor pivoted, summoning Michael Baldwin with the expectation of immediate compliance. To Victor, Michael represented continuity, a constant in a world where loyalty was increasingly fluid. Victor framed his concern as curiosity, suggesting that Jack and Billy's confidence hinted at undisclosed plans within Jabu, plans that required investigation before they could mature into threats. He tasked Michael with going behind the scenes to uncover intentions not yet made public, trusting that Michael's access and discretion would provide answers without leaving fingerprints. Yet this was not merely a request. It was a test layered in symbolism and implication. Victor produced the gift deliberately, an ancient Roman coin bearing the weight of history and conquest. The object was not valuable merely for its age, but for what it represented: allegiance sworn without condition, loyalty measured not by words but by acceptance. By offering the coin, Victor transformed a professional assignment into a moral crossroads, one that demanded clarity of alignment. Michael understood the gravity instantly. Acceptance would signal absolute devotion, a willingness to prioritize Victor's interests above all else, including personal ethics and relationships that had once guided his choices. Refusal, however, would not go unnoticed, and in Victor's world, hesitation was often interpreted as betrayal. The coin rested between them as a silent ultimatum, its presence forcing Michael to confront the cost of continued proximity to power. Meanwhile, Jack returned to the Abbott mansion, a place steeped in memory and unresolved conflict, where the echoes of past victories and failures lingered in every corridor. It was there that Nikki finally reached out, her call carrying an urgency tempered by hesitation. When she arrived, her demeanor reflected the toll of recent realizations rather than surprise. Her time with Victor over Christmas had clarified something she could no longer ignore. Her heart no longer aligned with the life she had tried to maintain out of habit and history. The distance she felt was not temporary, nor was it rooted in anger alone, but in the exhaustion of constantly reconciling love with manipulation. Sharing this truth with Jack was both a release and a risk, as it inevitably reshaped the terrain between Newman and Abbott once again. Despite acknowledging her emotional separation from Victor, Nikki did not abandon her role as a mediator. She urged Jack to reconsider the path he was on, warning that revenge, once set in motion, rarely stopped at its intended target. Her concern was genuine, shaped by the knowledge that escalation would draw others into the fallout, blurring lines that had already been tested too many times. Jack listened, conflicted but resolute, aware that forgiveness and justice were not interchangeable, and that retreat would be interpreted as weakness by those who thrived on dominance. Nikki's presence stirred old feelings and complicated loyalties, reminding Jack that some bonds endured despite rivalry, yet could not override the need to confront what he believed Victor had taken from him. As these events unfolded, Genoa City hovered on the edge of transformation, its most influential figures maneuvering into position for battles not yet openly declared. Victor's test of Michael threatened to redefine the boundaries of loyalty within his inner circle. Jack's determination signaled that the Abbott response would not be passive, even in the face of formidable opposition. Nikki's emotional reckoning hinted at fractures within the Newman empire that could no longer be concealed. Each interaction, each unspoken challenge, contributed to a growing sense that 2026 would not simply be turbulent, but decisive. In a city where power was inherited, earned, and stolen in equal measure, the coming confrontations promised to expose the true cost of allegiance, forcing every player to choose not only where they stood, but what they were willing to sacrifice to remain there. The observatory had a way of making everything feel both smaller and more exposed at the same time, as if the city's brightest lights were merely distractions and the real truths lived in the darkness beyond the glass. Claire's chance encounter with Holden began with a softness that didn't quite match the tension already living under her skin. She apologized for walking away from their breakfast the way she had, but even the apology sounded like a bandage over something still bleeding. Because what she had done afterward, throwing a cup of water in Audra's face, was not the kind of act that faded neatly into regret or bad timing. It was the kind of moment that lingered. A flash of humiliation and anger that made Claire feel briefly powerful and then immediately cornered by the consequences. Holden listened, attentive but guarded, and Claire felt that familiar pressure returning, the sense that he was always one step away from honesty, yet permanently choosing restraint. When the conversation drifted to Audra, Claire's irritation sharpened into a more focused suspicion. Because Audra was never merely Audra in Genoa City. She was a spark that caught on whatever fuel was nearby. Claire's mind inevitably pulled the thread back to Los Angeles, to the part of the story that still refused to sit flat. Sienna had admitted there was more, a confession that turned every gap in the narrative into an accusation. Claire didn't demand details with theatrics. She did it the way people do when they're trying to save themselves from being made a fool again, placing the question on the table like evidence and waiting to see whether Holden would respect her enough to stop dodging. Holden's refusal to discuss Los Angeles landed like a quiet slap, not because he raised his voice or threatened her, but because he made a choice in that moment. He chose secrecy over her. And Claire felt it in her chest like a drop in altitude. To regain control of the conversation, Claire pivoted toward Kyle, but even that felt like another wound being touched to test if it still hurt. She spoke of Kyle reaching his limit, of him deciding to move forward, and she tried to sound as though she had already made peace with it, as though closure had arrived politely instead of ripping through her life without warning. Yet the truth was messier. Kyle's decision did not feel like a mutual ending. It felt like the world tilting and leaving her scrambling to find her footing while everyone else pretended the ground had always been steady. Holden's question whether she was truly ready to accept that she and Kyle were done didn't sound cruel, but it carried weight because it forced Claire to confront the emptiness beneath her bravado. She admitted how sudden it all felt, how one moment she was still imagining a future that made sense and the next she was being told, implicitly and explicitly, to rearrange her entire identity without complaint. Freedom, she called it, but the word tasted strange in her mouth. Freedom meant she could do anything, yet it also meant she had to do everything alone. And in Genoa City, that kind of independence often came with a hidden price tag. Holden offered an escape disguised as an invitation, suggesting they spend New Year's together, letting the idea hover between them like a promise of warmth against the cold uncertainty she was trying not to show. Claire agreed, but she couldn't let the moment become sentimental without anchoring it in what still mattered most, Los Angeles. She made it clear that she would not keep walking into the future while the past remained weaponized in someone else's pocket. If Holden wanted to stand beside her, he needed to stop treating her like someone who couldn't handle the truth. They eventually drifted from the observatory to Crimson Lights, the familiar comfort of the coffee shop doing nothing to soften Claire's vigilance. Genoa City never allowed true privacy in public places, and Claire felt that instinctive tightening the moment she stepped inside, as if the air itself contained rumors. She tried to lean into the calm of normalcy, but it didn't last. Audra appeared the way storms do on the horizon, inevitable, almost theatrical, and impossible to ignore. Audra's presence turned the room into a stage, and her smirk carried the unmistakable pleasure of someone who lived for friction. The memory of the water incident flashed between them without needing to be spoken aloud. Claire's impulsive act, Audra's humiliating moment, and the unspoken agreement that neither of them would let it end there. Audra's taunting didn't need volume to cut. It was sharp precisely because it was casual, as if Claire's anger was entertainment. Claire's reaction was controlled, but her eyes betrayed the strain of holding herself together while someone tried to provoke her into becoming the villain of her own story. She told Holden she would find a table outside on the patio, choosing distance over spectacle, because she recognized that staying inside would only give Audra what she wanted, a second chance to make Claire look unstable, reactive, and small. The moment Claire stepped away, the dynamic shifted. Holden remained inside with Audra, and suddenly the secret Claire had been pressing for Los Angeles was no longer just a point of tension between Holden and Claire. It became a live wire between Holden and Audra, glowing with risk. Holden tried to do what Claire had asked him to do. Draw a line. Stop feeding the games. Stop allowing Audra's provocations to dictate the emotional climate. He urged Audra to stop pushing Claire, framing it as a warning rather than a plea, because he understood how quickly a petty feud could become a detonator in a city where grudges were currency. But the pressure inside him had reached the point where caution began to feel like cowardice. He made it known clearly, deliberately, that he was close to telling Claire everything about Los Angeles. That he was tired of living between two realities, the truth he carried and the half-truths he offered. The moment the possibility became real, Audra's composure tightened. Her confidence didn't vanish, but it sharpened into something more dangerous. The look of someone who understood consequences better than anyone else in the room. Audra warned him in a way that was almost intimate, not out of affection, but because she recognized that if Holden spoke, the fallout would not land on her alone. Holden had more to lose, more to be judged for, more to be destroyed by his reputation, his relationships, his future in Genoa City. Audra's warning wasn't just about protecting herself. It was about reminding Holden that the truth wasn't clean, that revealing it would drag everyone into the mud, including Claire, and possibly Kyle, and anyone else whose name had been connected to that trip. Holden insisted he didn't want to hide things from Claire anymore, that he was done letting secrecy define him, but even as he said it, the hesitation returned its pause of someone realizing that confession can be another form of harm. Because if what happened in Los Angeles was as complicated as Sienna suggested, then telling the truth wouldn't simply clear things up. It would rearrange loyalties, expose motives, and give new weapons to the people already circling for advantage. Outside on the patio, Claire waited with her hands steady, but her thoughts spiraling. She could see them through the glass, silhouettes moving in a space where she no longer had control, and she hated how familiar that feeling was, being just close enough to the truth to sense it, and just far enough away to be denied it. She told herself she was choosing dignity, but the choice still felt like punishment. She wondered if Holden's secrecy was protection or betrayal, and whether she was about to walk into another situation where the truth arrived too late to save her. Inside, Holden stood at the edge of a decision that would define him. Audra watched him with the calm of someone who knew how to survive scandal, and her warning lingered like smoke. If he told Claire, he risked igniting a chain reaction that could consume everything his fragile standing, Claire's hope of rebuilding herself after Kyle, and the careful narratives others were already crafting for 2026. If he stayed silent, he risked losing Claire anyway, not with a dramatic breakup, but with the slow erosion of trust that never stops once it begins. In Genoa City, the truth always came out eventually, but timing determined who bled the most when it did. Holden had to decide whether he would be the one to open the door or whether he would keep hiding behind it until someone else kicked it down. And when Claire finally looked at him, would she see a man who chose honesty, or a man who chose convenience, or worse, a man who chose the kind of loyalty that Victor Newman demanded from Michael Baldwin? Absolute, strategic, and terrifyingly expensive. And if Holden did speak, would Claire hear the truth as liberation? Or would it sound like the final proof that everyone in her life, Kyle, Holden, even the people she thought were allies, had been editing her reality for their own survival?